Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna. This is episode number 214, would you believe? My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland. We look after historic and a lot of current documents in these 4 buildings, which are in Inverness, in Wick, in Fort William and in Portree in the Isle of Skye. This series, Learn with Lorna, is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really, really grateful for that. It enables us to keep doing all the different things that we are doing, and you'll see later on our Facebook page some of the other things I'm doing today. So welcome and thank you so much for all of the views last week for World Gaelic Week. It was lovely to see so many. I think we're up at about 3,000-ish views, so thank you for that. And apologies again for the quality of the auto-generated captions, which didn't do a lot of justice in reproducing the Gaelic words. Now this week for episode 214, we're looking at the story of Inverness Museum, now Inverness Museum and Art Gallery, who mark 200 years of their collections this year and in fact this month. So thank you to Carrie, who you won't have heard me mention before, because Carrie is not part of the archive team. She is one of the curators at Inverness Museum and Art Gallery, so a colleague in the museums service. So I want to thank her for her work in putting together a timeline of the museum, which she is doing as part of some research into the collections, which then enabled me to use that as a template to look into our collections for some more information. The story of Inverness Museum and Art Gallery is absolutely fascinating. It sees the collections being moved and transferred and finding different homes and different curators, but of course it also records the changing role of museums across centuries. What do we need a museum to do? What do we want a museum to do? So to start this story, we need to go back to the 4th of March 1825 and listen in to a meeting being held in Inverness Town Hall. And this is how the meeting was recorded in the Inverness Courier of the 10th of March 1825. Institution for Science and Literature. A meeting of gentlemen desirous of forming an institution in this quarter for the promotion of science and literature and for the establishment of a museum was held in the town hall on Friday last. About 20 gentlemen attended, including several of the clergy. The chair was taken by James Robertson, Esquire, Provost of Inverness. After the chairman had briefly adverted to the object of the meeting, Mr. George Anderson entered into a more detailed statement of the views and expectations of the projectors of the institution, and mentioned various testimonies of approbation and promises of support received by him from individuals eminent in rank and science. So laying out his case for why this institution should be set up and why there should be a museum. And among those who have submitted letters of support include His Grace the Duke of Gordon, Sir George Stuart Mackenzie, Baronet, Sir Thomas Dick Lauder, Baronet, and Dr. Hibbert, Secretary of the Society of Scottish Antiquaries. He concluded by moving that the gentlemen present should form themselves into an association to be called the Northern Institution for the Promotion of Science and Literature. This being carried unanimously, it was resolved on the motion of Reverend Mr. Rose that a committee should be named to form the Code of Regulations and to arrange other preliminaries to be submitted to another general meeting to be convened within a short period. So, general agreement in the principles of what they want to do. On the motion of Dr. Robertson, Mr. George Anderson, FRSE, was appointed interim secretary, and thanks being voted to Mr. Anderson for the trouble he had taken in bringing forward this interesting measure, and to the chairman for his conduct in the chair, the meeting adjourned. And so that's where it starts. 200 years ago this week, a meeting held in the town hall, driven by George Anderson, a solicitor. Now, you've heard me speak, if you have been listening to the other 213 episodes, about my envy of those people who are able to wear loads of different hats and contribute to so many different parts of society and community. So George Anderson, as well as being a solicitor and as well as being the driving force behind the setting up of the institution and Inverness Museum, was also, over the years, an Inspector of the Poor, the founder of the Society of Inspectors of the Poor. He was a noted geologist. He was clerk to the District Board of Lunacy. He was an author with his brother of a guide to the Highlands and Islands, and he was the president of the Mechanical Institute. He's one of those people who left a mark in lots of different ways. And so the Northern Institution for the Promotion of Science and Literature was born. And a courier edition of the Inverness Courier from just a couple of weeks later shows how quickly things moved. So they've had that initial meeting where the idea of the institution and museum has been proposed, but we can see that within a couple of weeks the members got together again and proposed to circulate queries throughout the northern counties to gather information about antiquities surviving and deserving of preservation. So they're already going, okay, we're setting up this institution, what's already out there, what exists, what important features of historical interest do we need to know about. And at that second meeting, they also agreed to create an address that would be circulated amongst Highlanders abroad, seeking contributions for the museum, both financial and in the form of artefacts. And it was also noted at this meeting that Sir George Mackenzie announced that he would present a gold medal for the best account of the state of society and of knowledge of Highlands of Scotland from 1745 up to the establishment of this institution. So very quickly they have the idea and they put it into motion and they circulate this information, gathering records of what's out there and also looking for donations and support. So that's quite remarkable. But even more astonishing to me was an advert from September 1825, which reads, Northern Institution, a general meeting of the members of the institution is hereby requested to take place on Friday the 16th instant at 2:00 p.m. within the Museum, Ingle Street, which is now fitted up and ready for inspection. Competitors for Sir George S. Mackenzie's prize medal are again reminded that their essays must be given in by the 1st of September 1826. So within 6 months of having that initial conversation setting up the society, they have established a museum in Ingle Street in Inverness, a very small street which many of you will know if you're local, right in the heart of Inverness. And they have office bearers, including Robert Naughton, jeweller, who was the first curator. Now we hold in the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness a booklet written about the museum in 1981, and that date, you'll see why they wrote it at that date as we go on. But it too records that flying start. Over 150 donations to the museum resulted in the first 10 years, some items coming from the Highlands, others, such as a polar bear's skull, from as far away as Canada. These donations came to form the basis of the modern museum's collections. This early museum was in Ingle Street in Inverness, and to popularise it, a series of 12 lectures on chemistry were held there in April 1826. This programme attracted an average attendance of 110 people, and tickets were priced on a sliding scale, depending on whether the purchaser was an artisan, a gentleman, or a lady. So, straight away, they're not only forming a museum, but they're using the knowledge that they're gaining and the things that they're passionate about to teach and to share information with the community. Now, I also found in a browse through the British Newspaper Archive that over the years, lectures were hosted not only on the subject of chemistry, but also on natural philosophy and a range of other subjects, including meteoric cylindrical phenomena. So I don't know how everyone else's meteoric cylindrical phenomena knowledge is. Mine is not great, but I'm guessing it's to do with space and meteors. And looking through these articles, we find some really interesting information about what was being gathered in those first years. So I mentioned there that those hundreds of collections coming in of the first 10 years. So what sort of thing were they? What was making up the museum's collections in those in that first decade? Well, it's a really interesting summary, and I have, of course, no way to list all of it to you, but here's some of the things, some of which the museum still has within its collections, some of which has been destroyed, exchanged, or lost, or which the provenance of which can't be proved, and I'll come back to that later on. But here are some examples I found of early deposits into the museum's collections, okay? Specimens of cloth from South Sea Islands brought home by Captain Cook. A geological sketch of part of Sussex. Specimens of lamprey eels. American Indian daggers. A large slab of petrified wood from Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. Lava from Mount Etna. Giant hairy spiders of the West Indies. And a land turtle from Gibraltar, alive, it says in brackets. Carrie assures me they no longer have an alive, I don't think they have at all, a turtle from Gibraltar. It's fascinating because there's not an acquisition policy in sight there. They're basically taking in what is being given to them without, kind of, as far as I'm aware, without narrowing that collecting down. As well as those kind of more outlandish things, you also find things like coins, Roman finds, rocks, and other material from the Highlands. Perhaps most notably in 1834, a substantial collection of fossils, minerals, and geological samples given by the famous geologist and Highlander Hugh Miller. But that flurry of activity that took the first 10 years wouldn't last, as that 1981 booklet goes on to say. However, the population of the town was only about 13,000, with half of those illiterate, and the Northern Institution was unable to maintain support. Financial difficulties and political disagreements within its members accentuated its decline, and in 1834 the institution was disbanded and the museum was transferred to the Academy School in Inverness. So now I can turn to a series of records that we hold at the Archive Centre, the Inverness Royal Academy Director's Minute Books, because although the Northern Institution folded, doesn't mean that the collections were lost. We hold the Inverness Royal Academy Director's Minute Books from 1798 to 1907, and infuriatingly, the only volume we don't have is from 1834 to 1847, the year that the museum transferred. But we do very, very fortunately have a detailed index of all the minutes covering 1777 to 1887. So that means that I could at least go into that index and see what was discussed in the volume that we don't have. So that was absolutely brilliant. So even though we don't have the full minute of the meeting, we know what they talked about. And so I can see an entry in there that records that on the 20th of March 1835, George Anderson requested to see the museum removed to the Academy then on Academy Street. The next entry says that the chairman is to procure an estimate for alteration in the Academy Hall for the reception of the museum. And we find out a bit more about that in a later entry of what they were having to do in the Academy to accommodate these museum's collections coming in, because on the 6th of April 1835, the index reveals the plans and estimates for the arrangements of the accommodation of the museum were produced and approved of generally. And then further on, resolution to get the presses made and the stone floor raised and replaced as mentioned in the estimate. So they raised the stone floor and they put a wooden layer over it, or put a wooden floor down instead, and made these cases for the museum objects. Now, in 1836, we can see from the minutes of the directors that a complete British herbarium and a mineralogical collection was added to the museum, and also an entry that records George Anderson being appointed as curator for the preservation of the museum collections, tasked with creating a complete catalogue. He's a constant, George Anderson, for much of this story. Now, incidentally, the Northern Institute had made provision, when they set up the museum in 1825, they had made provision for their possible collapse. And so they had created a trust, vesting the whole property in certain persons should the institution cease to exist. So it's clever, because that's why the museum collections continued to exist. And so the museum moved from Ingle Street, from its early home, it moved into the Inverness Royal Academy, where George Anderson noted that he hoped it would be a receptacle for all the local productions of this country, which will render it interesting to strangers and highly useful to the educational advantages of the town. Now, no doubt, I don't know, but no doubt, this was initially considered to be a temporary measure to put the museum within the school. But a look through the IRA Director's Minute Books shows us that the museum remained within the school for the next 30 years. And it's really interesting to flick through that index to the Director's Minute Books and to look through the other minute books that we have and see entries like letter from writing master as to stove for his classroom, standard, right next to an entry that says skeleton of a Bengal tiger presented to the museum by Dr. Freeman in Aurangabad. So an interesting insight in those records to the dual function of the school at this time, that it's a running and operating as a school, but also it's running and operating as a museum. The minutes, the director's minute books of the Royal Academy do record talks and things and events happening in the Academy Hall where the collections were held. But really it wasn't an ideal situation because the school was focused, understandably, on the education of its pupils rather than the running and curation of a museum. And so in January 1863, it was recorded in the papers that the directors of Inverness Academy also proposed to rid themselves of a responsibility which it would have been well for the town if they had never assumed, namely the care of Inverness Museum. This was once a very valuable collection. These have been allowed to fall into confusion and deterioration, so that we doubt if they can ever be properly sorted or restored. It is worthwhile, however, to make an attempt, and as the directors are quite willing to resign in favour of some competent body, we trust that an effort will be made to render it useful and available to the public. A suggestion has been made that Dunbar's Hospital, which is the only building of any interest in Inverness, could be converted into a large hall available for the museum, for the mechanics library, for lectures and for other purposes. It would give a room 65 by 22 and 30 feet high, larger than any hall in Inverness except the northern meeting rooms. And if we turn back to the director's minute books of the Academy, we can see this decision recorded there as well, the one that we've just seen in the newspapers. We can go back to the Academy records and see how it's recorded there. And we can also note who was there to help with the move. On the 1st of May 1863, the director's minute book says, the vice chairman reported that a committee had been appointed as to the removal of the museum. They had examined the specimens in the hall originally acquired from the Northern Institution, and having obtained the assistance of Mr. George Anderson, who minutely inspected the same, it was ascertained that a number of the birds and beasts had been so much affected with dust and insects as to render their destruction absolutely necessary. And with regard to the minerals, geological specimens, dried plants, coins, paintings and books, etc., the committee thought Mr. Anderson had arranged for their removal in the meantime. The objects of antiquity being fitted up within the upright glass cases in the Mechanics' Hall in Bridge Street, and the heavy articles and specimens of rocks and minerals, etc., were packed into boxes and sent to the old poorhouse, the tenant of which, Mr. Mackay, has agreed to let them remain there until a new and proper place be found in which to replace the whole collection. So we can see through the minute books that a really clear chain of provenance in these collections. So it's founded by the Northern Institute. They refer there in those minute books to it coming from the Northern Institute and then it being removed out about 30 years later and to be placed into those different places for to be held in different split across different buildings. They also record that the cases, or some of the cases, were stored in the Gildry Room. It's a sad moment in the museum's story because so many items were deemed to be fit only for destruction, with other items being disarranged or their labels and information lost. So in a way it's a sad moment in its story, but on the other hand there's a continuity of people having a passion for keeping it going and making sure that the collection at some point could be put back together and re-shown to people. Within a few years, the collections would be moved again. This is from that 1981 booklet again. Museum collections were sadly neglected and had no permanent home. From the Academy, they were moved into the Mechanics' Institute, and from there, in 1865, to a locked room attached to the old town hall. Storage conditions were poor, and the museum was described as a sad wreck, a mere shadow of its former self, with many specimens having been lost, stolen, or allowed to decay. But in 1873, a campaign was launched to provide a building for a library, school of art, and museum. The project was progressive for its day, proposing that the new museum should be linked with an active teaching role in the field of art, and that museum resources should be made available to all sections of society, not just those who were well educated. And one of the drivers behind this campaign, so I've spoken a lot about George Anderson in those early years, one of the drivers behind this stage of the museum's story is the famous engineer Joseph Mitchell, who I have spoken about previously in earlier episodes, who presented a gift of £500 to the town council with the aim of establishing a free library for people to attend. So not a museum, but a library. But it all comes together because at the same time, discussions were underway in the town about finding a building for the museum and for the School of Art in Inverness, bringing these collections back out of storage, replacing and repairing them, and getting them on public show again. So there's two projects running concurrently. Joseph Mitchell putting the money in for a free library, and this look at reinvigorating museum and the art school. And the two projects come together. Subscriptions were gathered for the museum and school, but soon it was decided that by combining all of those objectives, a free library, a museum and an art school, and adopting the Free Libraries Act, that they could have a joint building with these services, and that Joseph Mitchell's £500 could be used and added to that pot for the greater good of those three aims. And we hold some circulars that talk about how they fought for contributions. We also hold the minute books where they talk about deciding what they're going to write, how they're going to get people on board to subscribe, to contribute to the museum, the School of Art and the library. And so after listing the achievements that the School of Art has already done and why it should be supported, it had 70 students incidentally at this time, this circular reads: "The committee are desirous of conjoining with this scheme the resuscitation of what was known as Inverness Museum. Half a century ago, a valuable and varied collection of local antiquities and objects of interest were made in Inverness. A collection was made in Inverness, assisted by the most liberal spirit of the townsmen who were scattered abroad in various parts of the world. It included much that illustrated the history, geography, geology, mineralogy. I can't work in a museum, you see. It included much that illustrated the history, geology, mineralogy, and social peculiarities of the Highlands of Scotland. One of its features was a very perfect collection of examples of the geology of the Highlands, presented and tabulated by our illustrious countryman, the late Hugh Miller. And we may also mention a valuable assortment of coins, stones, and flint implements found in the Highlands, numerous specimens of the arms and accoutrements of our ancestors, etc. In short, the museum contained very much that it is desirable should be in safekeeping and accessible to the public as illustrative of the Highlands of Scotland. This collection was for many years stored in the hall of the Royal Academy of Inverness and was a source of attraction to the people of the town and to strangers visiting the north. Some years ago, the directors of the Academy found it necessary to appropriate the hall for its own purposes, and the museum had to be removed. The contents were for a time accommodated in the Mechanics Institution. Since that institution ceased to exist, they have been stored without any attempt at order or classification in a locked room attached to the town hall. We beg to leave to suggest that a fitting receptacle might be found in connection with the School of Art. Both institutions have a claim upon the favourable consideration of our townsmen as instrumental to the higher culture of the people. The additional accommodation required for the museum would not greatly increase the expense of erecting a School of Art, and we trust that those interested in the Highlands of Scotland and in Inverness will liberally respond to this appeal for subscriptions to accomplish both objects." It concludes that document by saying that if there's a desire, then they will also accommodate a library. And they say, and I found this quite funny, they say, they finish this kind of appeal for support, financial support, by saying, "We hope we haven't been too misled in our belief about the progressive spirit of this district," which just felt a little bit barbed. You know, we've been told that you're going to support us, so if you don't, shame on you. I mentioned that we hold the Minute Book for Inverness School of Art and Museum Building Committee, and it's a fascinating read. The committee held fundraising events such as an exhibition of fine arts in the music hall. They have discussions in their Minute Book about whether it's necessary to have a detective in or whether they can just pay the local police and that will be enough. And these Minute Books also record their progress as they work towards raising the money to build this this new institution that would house all three of these things. So, for instance, they record their progress in fundraising, including a minute of the 27th of August 1873, noting that £50 had been received from Queen Victoria. And donations came in from all directions, and some of the people whose names always come up in every episode I talk about, they come up here too. So there are Fraser Tytlers in there are all sorts of big landed families. But I was particularly delighted to see the name Lieutenant General Sir Patrick Grant among the subscribers, because he was the grandfather of Isabel Grant, museum pioneer and founder of another High Life Highland museum, the Highland Folk Museum, which I've done an episode on previously, so please do go and have a look at that. But it's nice to see Patrick Grant just having a little role in supporting the development of the Folk Museum through his influence on Isabel Grant, and also the improvement and new buildings of Inverness Museum. The Minute Book contains the measurements for the rooms that would be desired for the new building, and also a really interesting entry reveals that the museum, library and art school were very nearly situated in Ardross Street, just outside the Northern Meeting Park, after an initial agreement was discussed in September 1874. So it could have been somewhere different. But in the end, it was a space behind the townhouse in Exchange Place, which is now Castle Wynd, that was donated by the town council, where the building was erected, designed by, of course, Alexander Ross. By this time, the management of the museum collections was the responsibility of the recently formed Inverness Scientific Society and Field Club, whose records we also hold. And incidentally, their transactions for 1881 record a meeting at which James Barron, spoken about the Barons previously as well, who was retiring as president at that point, he spoke about the early years of the museum, saying, "The catalogue before me is dated 1827 and is enough to excite our envy. The remnants of the museum we still have, but alas, they are meagre and fragmentary." But he mentions one of the earliest items, the bishop's gloves, taken from a crypt in Fortrose Cathedral, which the museum still have and which I'll share a picture of later on. They are elaborate gloves. This fundraising was successful and the new building was opened in 1881, with the opening ceremony performed by Joseph Mitchell. And it opened with a 3-week fine arts exhibition, which was so popular that it was extended to 2 months and welcomed over 9,000 visitors. And the following year, in 1882, it was opened permanently, with the library on the ground floor, the museum on the first floor, and the School of Art on the second floor. But inevitably, as you would expect, or as you might be expecting me to say, it very quickly became apparent that the building was not big enough to hold all three of these institutions, and the School of Art moved out to the high school, with the library and the museum continuing to share that building in what was Exchange Place. Now, if you remember, I mentioned at the beginning all of those diverse collections, the Gibraltar turtle and the South Sea cloths from Captain Cook and so on. Well, it was in the early 1900s that Inverness Museum really started to change its focus. Although diverse items continued to be cared for and displayed, they started to change their focus in what story they wanted to tell. In 1905, there was a very popular Highland and Jacobite exhibition with over 1,500 exhibits. And in 1907, it was decided that the museum would be reorganised with that focus in permanent new exhibitions. And it would, from 1908 onwards, have an appointed body of honorary curators and trustees to manage it. I looked at the detail of this in the Town Council minutes just to see what the Town Council had to say about that. And they record those decisions of the restructure and of the new body that would run the museum, so taking that control away from the Inverness Scientific Society and Field Club. The collections grew and grew, And as the committee invested in adding to them and requesting people to contribute, it's gone through a few years of being a collection that's got some problems, that's got some damage and so on. And so this is a point where they really start to accumulate again. Numerous deposits date from this period. Perhaps two of the most famous are the Ellie Mae Bowerbank collection of Jacobite items that came in 1910 and the 1935 collection of Prince Frederick Julep Singh, which was initially on loan to the museum but eventually was part bequeathed and part purchased, and both of those remain really key collections for Inverness Museum and Art Gallery. Now, incidentally, my favourite, Margaret McDougall, who was connected to the museum for over 25 years and was curator for 8 years, noted in one of her many wonderful research notebooks, "Is it not strange that this Highland Museum owes some of its greatest attractions not to the generosity of Highlanders, but to an English lady and an Indian prince and princesses?" But I would like to add to that there are also many equally appreciated collections that have been given by the generosity of Highlanders. I was completely fascinated to read through Meg's notes about the development and decision making behind Inverness Museum in the 1930s. As you'll know if you have been with me for the last few years, I'm always fascinated with Meg's notes. I love the way she writes things and researches things. And I wish I had time to read to you this entire notebook that she wrote about the history and development and decision making of the museum in the 1930s. It's lengthy, so I won't, but I wanted to share just a couple of things with you from it. She writes about not only the collections, what's in the museum and where they've come from, but more she writes about the changing vision of what a local museum should or could be. She says, while a national museum with a fairly large income, good buildings and a fully qualified staff may concentrate on a wide field of knowledge and seek to illustrate all of the arts of all of the people, such a course cannot, or rather ought not, to be undertaken by a museum which did not have the advantage and resource of a national museum. A provincial museum, particularly a small provincial museum, should wherever possible devote itself entirely to the preservation of the arts, crafts of its own area. Almost every country or area or county has some specially interesting feature. It may be historical, it may be industrial, it may be geological or archaeological, but no matter what it is, it attains a greater interest and obtains a greater educational value when fully developed, explained and displayed by its local museum. And she goes into great detail about how and why this could be achieved, the challenges of trying to change the story a museum tells, and the benefits that can come from that. And she details Inverness Museum's decision taking in 1935 to be a local museum telling the story of Highland, Jacobite and local themes. And she notes that that is broad enough for expansion and the collections will not be static, because by keeping those themes, they're wide enough to take constant interpretation and updating. The notebook then details the new layouts and content of each room in the 1930s after this decision has been taken and the process for getting there. She says that the remaining she says that they started by removing items that were out with the new scheme. So if they didn't fit into the idea of being Highland, local and Jacobite, then they started to be retracted from the museum displays. Some were stored, some were exchanged. Then there was the stage of examining, repairing and labelling the remaining items. How to alternate and display cases. I found it really interesting. She talks about how they physically altered the display cases and amended them so that exhibits could be brought closer to the eye. She talks about the challenges of displaying different items, how best to display something that's written, how best to display miniatures and so on. How do you put costumes out in a way that they can be best appreciated and understood? And the decisions that they took about whether to group items together or whether to separate them out. Again, what are the benefits and the challenges around that? And in the end of that 1935 reorganisation, she notes that Room 1, the biggest room, told a chronological story of the Highlands. Room 2 told the story of natural history, Highland only. Anything that wasn't Highland was withdrawn from display. And room 3, which she notes as being small and dark, she said that they made the use of it being a small dark room and turned it into a display of a typical Highland cottage with a figure in period costume spinning in the room. And she says it went from being the room that nobody liked to being the room that everybody loved. And Meg says that when the reorganised museum was opened, a few people queried, well, how do our children now see things from foreign countries? Where else can they go now to see things from elsewhere? And her reply was, you should know your own country first before you start to look at the others. But she says mostly the response was very, very positive. And she describes that through these decisions and through the middle years of the 20th century, the relationship between curator and visitor changed and grew closer. She also records Saturday lectures that took place in the museum for children, and she says that over 4 months, over 800 children attended these lectures voluntarily and out with school hours. So that very much looking at the changing relationship between the curator and the audience, and also between what can be done with these collections and who they can be used to reach. The next big change, and one well known by locals, and I'm sure people will have something to say about this, was the 1960s redevelopment of Exchange Place and Castle Wynd, when the old buildings were all demolished and replaced for modernist buildings. The museum collections were once again housed temporarily in Inverness Royal Academy, this time in the Mid Mills building, before the new complex opened in 1963, with one of those modernist buildings housing Inverness Museum and Art Gallery and the library. There was more reorganisation in the 1970s, both of collections and structure, because of course local government reorganisation in 1975 means that the running of institutions changes. And the museum and library, which had come together all that time ago through that revolutionary way of putting the building together with all of them, those services together, the museum and library remained together until 1981, when the library removed to Farallone Park, where it remains today, and Inverness Museum and Art Gallery finally got a building to itself and could expand with new galleries and a cafe. There have been subsequent other changes in structure or refurbishment, such as in 2007, the year of homecoming, and in 2015. But of course, that's one thing, the big changes around restructuring, reorganising, refurbishing. But the work of keeping the museum fresh and fascinating is always ongoing, as is the passion for bringing people in and sharing the museum collections with many audiences. We even hold minutes at the Archive Centre for the Museums Club in the 1980s. So on that note, if you haven't been to Inverness Museum yet, please go in. Please go and have a look at some of these things that I've talked about and think about the journey that Inverness Museum has come on in the last 200 years. If you have been in already, please share some love for them in the comments. They will appreciate that greatly. So as we wish Inverness Museum and Art Gallery a very happy 200th birthday, I wanted to finish with a quote from the wonderful Margaret McDougall, who wrote this notebook in the 1940s-ish, and who wrote, "Today, when the would-be visitor asks, 'What is there to see in Inverness Museum?' it can truthfully be answered, a living tale of a people's past told by everyday articles." So thank you very much for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed that. Thank you again to Carrie at Inverness Museum for her timeline and all the banter we've had backwards and forwards about some of the stories we've come across. I hope you can join me next week, where I'll be looking at the subject of street names. I will be once again leaning on Margaret McDougall. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you are able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next week.